So Carol. Welcome to the ACG Silicon Valley event, a renaissance in IP asset management, building a better mousetrap. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. For those of you new to ACG Silicon Valley, we are the leading business-to-business networking organization in Silicon Valley, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. ACG Silicon Valley is offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months. Next Wednesday, we have our members-only e-lunch with all the California ACG chapters. On Thursday, August 26th, our C-Circle will be featuring a panel discussion on a very hot topic, protecting your brand in an age of social justice. On September 8th, we have a panel of CEOs discussing growth or death, your choice. Many more events to follow in Q3, so we invite you to visit our website, ACGSV.org, to see the full calendar. Now, without further ado, let's get started with today's event. David and Becky, I'm handing the mic over to you. So Becky, if you want to start and introduce yourselves.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that introduction, and thank you for having us today. Really appreciate that. So I'm Becky Preby, and I'm a partner and head of design at Aventurine. And my background is in working with inventors and scientists to kind of accelerate bringing products to market. So I have experience working with kind of large and small companies, but mostly in emergent technologies. And that's what my role is here at Aventurine. And today I'm going to be interviewing our founder, David Van Wee, and let him talk a little bit about Aventurine and his background and how that led us to the point we are today. Oh. David?
Well, that's great, Becky. Thank you for introducing me there briefly. And I'm really looking forward to today's event, as you were mentioning just a moment ago, Becky. This is really what we're all about at Aventurine, is interacting with people and describing how developments in intellectual property are going to affect businesses, particularly in emergent technology, sometimes in more mature industries too, but our real focus is on people putting together foundational technologies that are really going to move big markets, but change how people live and how they interact. And that's really what has animated our whole business. It's my background as an entrepreneur. I've done a variety of different businesses. Two of them were what you'd call a deep tech play. In both instances, we were working with hardware and software and really doing something new for the first time. And that's really where I began to see how intellectual property can affect certain kinds of companies. I've also done a variety of other sorts of businesses and advised lots of other kinds of people. So that really highlighted for me the difference between businesses that are really science focused and are doing something for the very first time from other more traditional startups or mature companies. And so to me, it was a natural step to come work with the team at Aventurine to really try to bring what I've learned from that experience, but also what my research uncovered when I tried to get to the bottom of why there weren't good services available, why I couldn't find people who really understood the commercial value of research. They could see the commercial value of a product right away, but the commercial value of research was just not a concept that they could really invest in or really even understand how to develop. And so in my background and my history as an entrepreneur, I've tried to learn what I can from each of these different types of experiences. And what I've taken away from it is that the world needed something new, that there was a space that had opened up because of history, because of the way markets have developed, where there really was no good way to bring investment to the right stage of an early company's history, or to really be able to focus on the asset value, the financial value of intellectual property. And that's the gap that we decided would be a great place to build a business. And that's why we created Aventurine.
Yes, and I'd like to say I'm proud to be part of it, and I'm excited to have David tell a little bit about his background in depth here today and explain some of the history and things that he's learned dealing with intellectual property over the years. So I think to get started, recently and in the last couple of years, there was a article that came out from IAM, which is a media outlet that talks about intellectual property. And they listed they listed intertrust patents as one of the most valuable patents in history. And being one of the named inventors on those patent families, I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about intertrust and how that came about and how the strategies that you employed at Intertrust to develop this valuable patent family.
Sure. Yeah, the intertrust story is one in which I learned a great deal, both about a very interesting corner of technology. First, I'll just say a word about what we did. We were working on secure distributed computing. And in particular, what was really concentrating our minds were the issues around digital rights management, around moving around intellectual property at the time, back in the late 80s and early 90s. This was done with CD-ROM and technology along those lines and online services. And we saw a world in which that was going to be democratized and commoditized as the internet really moved into high gear, and so did the big rights holders. So we were a group of researchers with the right kind of science and publishing backgrounds from different disciplines to be able to come together and get to the heart of it. It was a more interesting problem than we thought at first. We reached the conclusion that you simply couldn't do it with a traditional computing architecture. You could simulate it, but you couldn't really do it. You'd have to redesign the microprocessor, create a different operating system layer, change how application frameworks worked, and then put a 24/7/365 architecture around that to keep it all running, to keep it all working. And so we went in and we proposed that to a variety of people. We went into Intel and into the senior executive team and proposed that, something just like that to them. I was young and earnest at the time and laid it on the line for them that this was how it was all going to be, and would they like to participate? And they didn't, at least not at first. But on the other hand, Steve Jobs at Apple got a good look at what we were doing and used it as the heart of the architecture for first music distribution using the iPod, and then the architecture for the iPhone. And it subsequently was adopted by Google and their Android systems, and has been used by every smartphone manufactured for the last 15, 20 years. And that architecture was fascinating, but so too was the story about how what I just said came about. Because one of the things we discovered early on is even after it became clear that this was going to work, and by work, I mean it had an $8 billion IPO, it was clear that it was going to work. Even at that stage, we didn't get the interest from the venture capital community that I would have expected. It wasn't my first startup, and it certainly wasn't my last. And looking at the commercial potential that we had identified and the proof points we had created around it, it was at the time mystifying to me why venture capitalists weren't really grabbing this opportunity. Now, we found alternate financing. As I said, it went well. It turned into what it did. So there are workarounds, but what there wasn't was ready access to the capital markets for this type of innovation and this type of business. And now, again, later on in my career, after doing several more companies, I had another business come along that really gave me some further insights, but that led to this company, Aventurine. But to say more about what Intertrust was all about and what it did, how we created the most valuable patent family in history, was by knowing that it wasn't going to happen by itself, that we weren't going to be able to just assume that the market was going to buy our products and that would be enough, or that if we put in place a patent, that would suffice to do what we were hoping to do, which is protect our research, all the years of effort that we put in, all the insights we've created. We wanted to be sure that we could be part of bringing that to market, as much to ensure that there was a standard out there that people could adhere to so it could grow the way it did. It's a big part of why you want a license and why you want to be able to create viable intellectual property. Because if you've solved a huge problem, the likelihood that your startup is going to be able to do the whole thing is low. We knew that. So we built an intellectual property portfolio that was designed first and foremost as a financial asset and as a strategic tool. It wasn't just an effort to take research and write it down and protect it. We wanted to do more than that. And we anticipated the way the market would evolve in several different areas. We were able then to create an intellectual property portfolio that covered those. Now, we did some that didn't work or didn't develop until much later. For example, we described DocuSign back in the mid 90s, and it wasn't ready to be a business until after the IP had expired. So not all of them worked, but enough of them did, because the foundation for the smartphone was sufficient to encourage Sony and Philips to buy the public company and take it private again. And they were then able to use it in other markets. For example, they were able to take that intellectual property and use it as the foundation for the Blu-ray standards that they put in place there. So in that instance, and that would not have been available readily to the company without an intellectual property portfolio. Our focus, our product focus would not have made that viable, but by including both a product and an intellectual property perspective from the beginning, we were able to create lots of options for ourselves. We were able to adapt as the market came along because we had created a strategic portfolio that was really resilient to the kinds of things that the serial infringers will want to do, but also gave us business tools to really grow so that we could form licensing arrangements with people who would really benefit from the technology and get them using it. So it's a two-part strategy. On the one hand, there's a defensive piece and a protective piece, but on the other, it's a strategic tool that you can use to develop your business. And that was really the thing that I take away first and foremost from that InterTrust experience, was to think strategically, build these as strategic assets, and don't imagine it's going to take care of itself.
I think it's really interesting, because one of the things that I think is unique about this approach, like you've said, is the looking at the IP and as an asset, a strategic asset, and nurturing it into something that's viable for the business and provides benefit to the business in additional ways that some people don't necessarily look at the intellectual property. And I was wondering if maybe, based on the story of InterTrust, if you could summarize, if you were talking to somebody in an early stage venture, what kind of maybe high level advice would you give to them based on what you said, if you were talking directly to them, to use this approach that you've learned from your experience to benefit them as they grow their own venture and assets?
Well, the very first thing I would tell them is that if they're going to go down the entrepreneurial road, they shouldn't. Stop, don't do it. As a serial entrepreneur, I have to get that out there. But if you've decided you're going to ignore me and go on anyways, I'd say really the first set of decisions you're going to make is about what you perceive and what you view, what you value within the research that led you to decide to move into the commercial realm, and how widely applicable that research is. Is that research really enabling a particular business, a particular company? And if it is, that brings you down one kind of pathway for intellectual property. If, on the other hand, your research covers lots of different things, of which the go-to-market vehicle is merely the low-hanging fruit, the easiest to fund, the easiest to develop, whatever kind of operating reasons you've chosen to pick that operating company, that the intellectual property is actually much bigger than that. And so there's, in those two cases, in the first case, if the intellectual property is playing more of a supporting role in what you're doing, because the research is very much targeted on a particular application, that puts you into a realm where you should think about the intellectual property in a somewhat more conventional way than the one I'm going to focus on in a minute, where you have something that's bigger than that. And there, your portfolio strategy should still have the kind of high quality design that you would want in any portfolio, but your focus is much more on defense. Your focus is on much more on trying to protect someone from readily copying your device or your machine, broadly defined, that you've patented, that you're really trying to establish mostly a moat, mostly a defensive type of an arrangement. And that's because the commercial opportunities for the IP are limited to within the four walls of the business. It's probably not worth the investment to do more than that. You probably should save your money for things that are more important to growing your company than really trying to do what I'm about to say, which is, if you, on the other hand, do have a robust what we call a foundational intellectual property portfolio, the first thing I'd say you should do is to really think very strategically about the different market spaces that you could enter with it. And that your first goal is going to be to fully align your business strategy and your IP strategy. That's the first, that's your objective. That's the first thing you want to achieve, as you're going to market. And so the way to do that is to be immersed in the process of designing your go-to-market vehicle and your intellectual property at the same time, but recognizing that they're not the same thing. That your go-to-market vehicle is going to operate more like a traditional startup. It's going to operate on a cycle time of weeks, whereas your intellectual property, if it's any good in this foundational way I'm describing, is going to last for at least 20 years. And not only is it going to last for 20 years, your best year is going to be year 20, followed by year 19, followed by year 18. And that's a very different proposition, because on the one hand, you're nurturing a very long-term asset. And on the other hand, you're trying to figure out how to bring a product to market, how to bring a company into existence as a startup. And so you recognize right away that these are different, but you also have to integrate them, even though they operate on different cycle times and they have different objectives, different overall timeframes, even because most startups, good successful startups, don't last 20 years, right? They'll exit in 7 or 10 years. And so when you're looking at that framework, if you've discovered that you really believe that you have a foundational intellectual property portfolio, the questions you should ask yourself: is this really going to be baked into the stack, as we like to say in our business? Is this really going to be built into what everybody's going to need to do for the next 20 years or more? And does it really get to the heart of something fundamental? Is it really solving a problem that everybody knows is a roadblock? Everybody knows it's a bottleneck. And when you find those two elements, this is something that's likely to last, because once you start doing it this way, why would you stop? And then furthermore, that it has this broader applicability to it. It has this wider lens that applies to the research. And if you've done that, then it's worth working through the strategy, designing a real portfolio strategy with a number of different Sentinel patents in it, and thinking about the inventive group and the people who are involved in which areas they're really the most focused, and then devising a plan in concert with your go-to-market that takes into account the rest of your business, the potential exit partners, that helps you identify who are the competitors from an IP point of view, not just competitors from a commercial point of view. And then when you begin to look at both of these, you get a fuller picture of what your business is really all about. And I'll tell you one other thing. This is a word of advice. People who are really interested in your startup are very rarely going to be willing to invest in your intellectual property. Their investment thesis is almost always driven by how quickly your startup is going to grow, what the end size is going to be, and not by the quality of the intellectual property. If it's evaluated at all, it's a tick box. If you have it, you're good. If you don't, maybe it lowers your price a little bit. The deal is about sales, growth of sales, size of the overall market, how addressable is that market? That's what it's about. On the intellectual property side, don't expect that that's going to get the same treatment from that investor as you should give it, because you know what you've created. You know that this intellectual property asset is going to continue to yield for much, much longer than the venture capitalist is interested in. I mean, all that return in year 20 doesn't matter. That's just irritating. It's just annoying, because that money is going to somebody else. They got to be out in 5 to 7 years. If somebody else is going to be making money off of their deal in 20 years, it just makes them mad. They're not going to treat it the same way, but you do. As the leader of the organization, as the person who really understands your balance sheet. I've got this operating company and I've got these IP assets, and they work together, and you're responsible for being a steward of both.
Yeah. So you really have to look at it in a way that you have two things, major things going on, and they're both valuable. One has a very long-term potential value that can live beyond the exit of the venture. And then one is the operations, which is what most venture capitalists are interested in investing in. So that's kind of a unique approach. And I think what led to Intertrust having one of the most valuable patent families in history. So to look at it in that way is really interesting. What about, I know I heard you talk about this before. What about on the other side of the coin? So in larger corporations who have already acquired or amassed and developed their own intellectual property and have lots of it, you know, that's being used, or even some that might not be being used in the market at this time, what do you think about that? Like, how would you talk to those people and how they could look at their IP and maximize its value?
There's two ways to approach that, because you're absolutely right. In larger, more mature organizations, especially within the usual suspects of the research domain, there are businesses out there that do a ton of very high quality research that's really well developed, and even in some cases really well protected, but that the commercial side of the large business doesn't really have any direct use for. So there is this disconnect within larger organizations, and it's not just companies. It can also happen in universities and national labs, but it's really noticeable in companies because they're supposed to be making money off of everything they do. And that's especially true today, where the idea of really investing in research is not anything like it was in the past, where it was really seen as something that had these intangible qualities and inspired new products. And it's really not playing that role much anymore. The way most companies bring on new products and innovate is by acquiring a small company that did something cool. That's a change in the way things are done. But not all of the companies out there have followed along. Pick some of the larger research organizations. You look at in the United States, maybe HP or IBM or companies like that. You look in Europe, you might look to Siemens or Philips and businesses like that, where they really are investing very heavily in research that ends up going dormant. That's the term for it, which is to say, I did all this great work and then fell on the floor, right? Actually, nothing ever got done with it. So in those kinds of businesses, so on the one hand, I'll say you're spending money on these patents that you're not doing anything with, right? So maybe there's a way we can generate something here if it's any good, but why? The reason to do that is because we can't afford to have innovation falling on the floor. We cannot afford as a society, as a civilization, to not bring these important innovations into the market because of these circumstances of how the research was done. When the brilliant breakthrough happens, it doesn't matter a ton where it happened. What matters is that we're able to get it to market. So how can we help? How do we get involved in those cases? There, what we're trying to do is find the innovators, find the people who are doing the operating company, who have something very exciting and current research that's in really great shape, and try to match that with some dormant IP that is likely very well funded. It's probably older, and you can pull that together, and in so doing, you're able to kind of take that huge research investment in the big company that has no outlet, and you're able to help it get to market. You're able to find a pathway. And in the process, you can empower an early stage entrepreneur who has amazing current research, but kind of has a little bit of a gap in the depth of their portfolio. Now suddenly you can enable that. Now they've got the brand of a big company behind them, and they've also got the intellectual property to be taken seriously by some of the big players in the market. So it's one of those cases where you're able to both limit costs and provide a real growth opportunity, but the brand has got to be at the heart of all that, isn't it? I mean, if you have one of these companies and you're doing this kind of research, you can say honestly that you're taking all of your research and you're doing everything you can to bring it out into the market. And I think that's as important to these businesses as anything else.
Yeah, it's funny because I just read on this post on our LinkedIn earlier today about that U.S. Intellectual property in the United States is worth something like $6 trillion. It's like 38% of the gross domestic product, which is quite a shocking number when you think about it. I mean, I don't think that people ever think about intellectual property in that way. You know, I mean, they think of it as something that companies have, right?
Right.
That it's something that has been created, and I think that people feel that it's valuable because a lot of companies, a number of companies I've worked with have, as well, when you're innovating, filing patents is very important, right? But it seems like a lot of times those, once the patent's filed, a lot of it's kind of closeted, and you know, it's not really nurtured in that way. And I don't think that people realize how much it actually directly contributes to the economy, which is, that's a significant number. Yeah, anyway, okay.
The American innovation economy has gotten blocked up, and that's certainly one of my persistent worries, and one of the things I'm very hopeful that our business and others are helping to address, which is that we in the United States have built more intellectual property value than the rest of the world combined.
Yeah.
Yet our innovation economy is faltering and sputtering, and some absolutely brilliant research is simply not making it into commercial products, even though the commercialization potential is clear. And that is something that's a state of affairs that we can, no civilization can afford to do that. It's a waste of a type that is simply unacceptable, I think, in the big picture, when people find it and they see what's happened to our innovation economy and why these things, because many of the forces that have conspired to put us in the mind we're in today are entirely of our own doing. We tried to reform our system, and in the process, we ended up empowering the people we were trying to disempower, and disempower the people we were trying to help. We were trying to eliminate the problem of so-called trolls, which people abusing the patent system in various ways. And we ended up empowering them and enriching them, and making it even harder for an individual inventor or a small company to successfully protect their intellectual property. Now, there's things you can do about it, but we made it harder. And some of those things I'm hopeful will change, and other of those you simply have to adapt. Intellectual property has been what it is for literally hundreds of years. It's gone through a lot of changes, and there's some recent ones that I'm hopeful will move the needle just a little bit more towards the middle in the balance between the inventors and our licensees, also known as the serial infringers.
Right. It's an interesting story how intellectual property came about. That's actually why this event is called what it is, the Renaissance in IP asset management. One of the reasons. I don't know if people are aware of it, but intellectual property was invented, I guess, in the during the Renaissance in Venice, and I learned that from you. But it was a very interesting story. Maybe you should. That's a good lead into us to talk a little bit about the things that we're doing to try to help develop the potential of intellectual property, and you know, recognizing that intellectual property is literally a creation that's coming out of someone's brain, right? It's a vision or an idea or something that sparked something in someone that they discovered or themselves created, and then protecting that. So maybe you could just tell the story a little bit of one, how it came about, and then how it led you to even the name of Aventurine, and then we can talk a little bit about the programs and stuff that we do. And I don't know, I didn't ask Yvonne this at the beginning, but if there's time for questions at the end, if people want to ask questions, we can do that as well, I think. I'm not sure. But maybe go ahead, talk about
Sure.
The story of Venice.
Well, I'd be happy to. I won't spend a ton of time on it, but it is a good way of getting to the heart of why intellectual property is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Venetian patent statute back in Venice, I don't recall the precise date, but it was during the high part of the Renaissance period. And what they were doing at that time is in Venice, they were making the best glass in probably the world, but certainly in Europe. And they had developed some really highly refined and proprietary techniques for making truly beautiful objects out of glass. And the worry was that people would come to work in Venice and then take this amazing technology and bring it back to other places. And then suddenly the markets for Venetian glass would dry up. And so this kind of gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Because it's one thing to have a brilliant idea. It's another thing to be able to bring it to market, to identify and value its commercial qualities, because commerce is something organic that human beings do. Commerce is not something over there or done by other people. You can look back into the Neolithic period and you'll find really good tool making stone hundreds of miles away from where it must have been quarried. Commerce and the interaction, the value of commerce and the role it plays in people's lives is fundamental. You don't get to have inventors in society unless you create intellectual property rights. Same with musicians. Do you want musicians? Do you want authors? Do you want poets? Do you want movies? If you want any of those things, you must have a way to pay your mortgage. You got to be able to feed yourself. You have to be able to take the fruits of your mind and turn it into dollars.
Yeah.
And if you're not able to do that, it's simply not going to happen. It exists purely as a theoretical exercise and a much less developed civilization than the one we live in today. The intervening period between the Renaissance and now has led to the greatest burst of technological innovation the world has ever seen, by far. And the intellectual property system is at the heart of that. It's how you get paid to do it, ultimately, maybe not directly, but ultimately, that's where the money is coming from. That's making it possible for people to integrate this into their lives. And so for me, when I think about where this is going now and the renaissance that's happened today, it's, I think, in understanding how the intellectual property markets have shifted. The fact that there are tools available to inventors and entrepreneurs. All is not lost, but it's not going to happen by itself. You can put in place the necessary tools to protect your research, and you can protect it from poaching, you can protect it from inappropriate uses, not just money. You can ensure that your research is being used in the way that you want to have it used. And this right only lasts for a limited period of time. The other genius of the patent system is that you get these rights and you harness these commercial interests. But then in the case of the most valuable patent family in history that underlies the smartphone, it expired. It belongs to everybody now. Y'all can do whatever you want with it for the rest of the time. We just got it for a little while, and then it belongs to the world, it belongs to everybody. You can build the rest of civilization on top of it.
That's fascinating. Well, so the story, the tie from the story to Aventurine is in the name, and the Aventurine was the name of the glass that was invented in Venice, right?
It's one.
That the patents were. Well, so I think maybe it'd be good to talk. We could talk a little bit about like what we're doing. Like when you look at what's happening in the world of intellectual property and the landscape right now for inventors, and then you look at this new kind of it's actually not new, but this way of looking at intellectual property as something that's of value that you can nurture and can be of benefit to all the stakeholders, not just a corporation, but to inventors, to society at large. But I think if we can talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing, it seemed like there were some people that might be on the call that might be interested in kind of how we've taken those problems and then that strategic approach and we're trying to build something that leverages those two things. A strategy solves a problem and actually creates a ecosystem and a structure by which to help fix it, right? So maybe you can talk, you're better at talking about that than I am, so I'm gonna let you. And I apologize to people on the call, like I am the designer, if you didn't hear that at the beginning, some other people joined, but so my role in the company is primarily to design. So David's much more adept at talking about the overall vision and the strategic kind of approach and ideas that he has and why he's created the system. So maybe you can talk just a little bit about that whole ecosystem.
I'd be happy to. Can I just pause for a moment, though? You're right. I didn't explain the name Aventurine. I'll only take a minute.
Okay.
So Aventurine is a truly beautiful mineral. It's a lovely green color with flecks of what really appear to be true gold in it. And it luminesces, you know, when you move it around. It's really a truly beautiful object, and you could see why the people who came up with it were pretty proud of it. But it was actually, Aventurine comes from by accident in Italian. They had accidentally knocked something into the glass, and it had produced this amazing, beautiful material, which then went on to become kind of the claim to fame of one of the big Venetian glassmakers. Later, much later, geologists found this mineral in nature. So Aventurine, that glass is an example of a mineral that was first discovered by being created by its inventors. But then again, we discover what we always do, which has been there in nature the whole time.
Right.
And that was part of what made it interesting. That we're inventing, but what we're really doing is we're figuring out how nature really works. And yes, we put it to useful ends, but in the end, that's where it all comes from. So the system, how do we build an ecosystem? First of all, we really have to think about access to the capital markets, sure, but also providing people an environment where they can really develop these ideas, where they actually have the time that's needed to focus on the inventive phases and turning that into these commercial assets we were talking about. Working on a startup, but not necessarily having a startup that is ready to launch. And I think a big part of what we did is say, you're not on your own. It's not just about grant money, although if you work in that area, you might have some grant money, but that's really a period of time where other investors haven't shown interest. And it's because we know, I know as a chief investment officer, that they're actually creating extremely valuable assets in that period of time, and that you have to find a way to invest in that if you really want to enable it to happen more, if you really want to address some of the innovation barriers and establish access to capital. And so part of it is to get involved early. And that means we need scientists. We need more scientists and more engineers than your typical investment firm would. We have programs we've put in place. Our scientist in residence program is one of them, where we build a network of individuals who can really help the people who we work with, either people we're working with as advisors or people we're working with from an investment point of view. It's really it's essential that we have the ability to really relate and interact, because we have to get to the truth of the matter, and we also have to protect it and understand it. And so if we have a different philosophy, it's to get involved early. And if we have a different perspective from the research side, who are saying, where have you been all this time? Of course you should be investing earlier. On the other side, it's to say, you can't harden commercial research into a valuable asset without a business plan. It may be wrong. You may need to iterate it a few times. I promise you will. I told you shouldn't do this, right? I told you never become an entrepreneur. But if you do, if you don't listen to it, you're going to go through more iterations than you will in a classic, typical startup environment, because for simple reason, you don't know as much. You have to do more commercial experimentation before you're really ready to properly commercialize. And then you can get on a track that looks very similar to a more conventional startup. But our goal is to foster an environment where our expectations are set around this being what we're going to encounter, as opposed to asking you what your month-to-month growth rate is. Nothing wrong with that. It's just premature. And in many instances, it's asking the wrong question first. As an investor, I want to know about your intellectual property. I may be interested in your go-to-market company, or I may not be. If you've got good intellectual property, I'll listen to what you have to say about your go-to-market, which makes our pitch meetings the absolute opposite of what you would normally encounter. So what you have from an ecosystem is somebody myself, I run a couple of these companies, and I'm trying to be the firm that I wish I had had. I want to be the investor and advisor that I wish had been there when I was doing Intertrust, and later when I did Sococo, social communications company later on, the company I did right before this one. Both Silicon Valley companies, both very deep into tech. It wasn't any access to capital. By the time I did Sococo, of course, I was a cashed out entrepreneur. I could walk in the front door on Sandfield Road and get a meeting with anybody I wanted to. They still wouldn't invest. Same reason. That's when the penny dropped. That's when I understood, wait a minute, there's something going on. This is a pattern. Now the market's totally different, technology is totally different, yet the response of the capital markets is the same. So what I'm setting out to do is change that. That's what we're out to do. So we put in place specific programs to do that within what we do, but that's the philosophy behind it.
What do you think? What do you think the future looks like? Like if you were to predict a more blue sky future that supported invention and entrepreneurship in a way that really valued people and their ideas, what do you think that would look like?
Well, I think you used the key words as valuing people and their ideas. It is become fashionable in the world of investment to say that ideas are worthless and useless. And they kind of are from an operating company point of view, but they're really not from the point of view that we've been talking about today. So if we had an environment in which inventors had an element of recognition and were able to participate in these discussions in the way I think that they ought to, and that we would have a world in which authors are known for their books, and movie makers are known for their movies, and the actors are known for their acting, and the musicians are known for their songs. It's only really in the world of intellectual property that we're all told to just get lost and pound sand. And that's wrongheaded. It represents not that we need fame and glory. Most inventors don't really do it for that. Most inventors do it because they're doing it wrong out there in the world, and they're trying to set them straight. This is how you should do it. They want to see their stuff used. They want to see the world change in the way that they thought, and that's really what motivates them. And just like a musician may not know exactly how to fill all the seats in the stadium or how to distribute their streaming when it's all said and done, and they don't need to. It's being able to recognize, though, that you don't just tell them to go pound sand. They're part of the process. That they're, as creative people, they're maybe not asked about everything, but they're treated with the kind of decency and respect that you think would happen. This has happened in the U.S. history. I mean, of course, everybody's heard of Thomas Edison, right? Who have you heard of since? That's the problem, right? Yes, we can do this, and it isn't about, as I say, fame and glory. It's about recognizing that the people who do this are a very important part of civilization. There aren't any extra inventors. There aren't any people wandering around who we don't need in this area, and we should treat them that way. We should treat people who do this kind of work as though they mattered, because they do.
This is interesting because when you were talking about that, it's, invention is an occupation, right? So it sounds like that's a perception that has shifted. I think a lot of times people, scientists, researchers, even entrepreneurs who have great ideas get overwhelmed by the bigger part that society sees of building a big company, right? Or you have to make it into this giant thing, where a lot of times, as you were saying, a researcher or even an entrepreneur and somebody who's truly has kind of an invention mindset really does just prefer to create, right? To invent things, but they're forced into the society of, like, in order to generate a sustainable income or way to survive off of that invention or ideas or creation, they have to commercialize it in a way that is what's like the typical route, right? And that's, you got to build a company, and the company, there's a bunch of stuff you have to worry about now, even if you're not really interested in that part, but you have to do that. And it's interesting because it also reminded me of how in, kind of what we would call ancient times, Greek, or, even during the Renaissance, and even early in the US in some ways. I've been reading Thoreau a lot recently, so I might interject some here. But it talks about philosophy, and it used to be that being a philosopher was a thing. Like that's what your job, or that's what your, maybe not job, but your occupation in society was, being a philosopher. And it's kind of similar to that. So you would go to that person and talk about thinking great thoughts, right? Like it's like that's how invention seems to it seems on par with the same thing. And one of the things that we've been talking about at Aventurine, and one of the things we say in our materials, is making it safe to invent again. And I think that all of this, all of this thought and strategy and kind of invention around how you look at intellectual property and how you look at intellectual property as an asset is based in that. It has its foundations in, giving these people the opportunity to benefit society as a whole. Even they're doing like real commercial value. They're contributing to the GDP, in a huge, significant way, right? So that's an interesting, it's a really interesting way to look at it. Is there any last thoughts that you wanted to share that you thought might be valuable to this group of people? And if not, maybe we can ask Yvonne if she wanted to let people ask questions, or.
Why don't we open it up? I think we've had a chance to talk about all the things I was hoping to speak to today. If people have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Cool.
Absolutely. Please feel free to ask questions. Anybody?
Sometimes it's awkward in these things at the end if nobody has a question, you're kind of like, oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Zoom makes it difficult too.
While people are contemplating their questions, thank you. This was a very informative and interesting discussion or fireside chat. So truly appreciate both of you, David, you answering the questions, Becky, you being there and filling that in. So are there any questions? Anyone? No, you must have given all the information that was needed.
Well, that's okay. I appreciate everybody joining us and allowing us to share our thoughts and ideas, and especially, some of David's unique and valuable insights on how to leverage intellectual property. It's good.
Any final words, David?
Oh, and I really enjoyed. Yeah, I loved it. My favorite subject, and maybe that comes across. I'm hopeful that some people found it useful, or at least a little entertaining.
Perfect. Well, once again, thank you so much. And if anyone does have a follow-up question, feel free to reach out to Carol or me, and we'll connect you with David and Becky. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.